Hey guys, Ron here. Hope everyone's well. Coming to you from very cold Southern California, or what I consider very cold. Not what most of you do, but with me. I complaining about this on every video lately, and I'm still complaining about it. It's, I don't know, somewhere between 45 and 50 degrees. To me, that's really friggin' cold. So tonight, I couldn't get away during the day, and tonight I was going to go up to Beverly Hills and film maybe a celebrity house or so and a night shot and talk to you. But I thought in this freezing cold, and it's going to be actually colder. It's actually warmer here near the water. For some reason, the water the water makes things warmer, the air warmer. I don't know exactly why. The harbor in particular. But I thought I could go up to Beverly Hills, which is going to take me half hour at least to get to, and then spending 10 minutes outside, it'll probably be 43 degrees or I'll be freezing to death. So I'm here at the harbor again, and I'm going to talk to you about a subject that we don't think about a lot anymore. But if you watch my channel, you know not only do I do celebrity homes, but I've done hundreds of them. So I'm running out of subject matter there, and I've branched out in the last year to other subjects, true crime, things like that. And today I'm going to do something again, like I said, we don't think of much anymore, but it's still kind of a mysterious, interesting subject, especially in American history. It's the subject of the Watergate break-in, which brought down President Richard Nixon's presidency. First resignation we've ever had. Pretty unbelievable stuff. And I venture to say most of us either weren't alive or were way too young to know what was going on between 1972 and 1974. So being a student of history, particularly American history that I am, particularly 20th century, well, let's say from World War II till today, I can't believe how many people are out in this cold. And they're hardly, and you know why they're not wearing heavy jackets? You know why they're cold? Because unlike me, they're from somewhere else. None of them are from here. They're all from Nova Scotia or New York or Boston or God knows where, Wisconsin, and they're used to it. They moved out here, but hey, it's just like old home week for them. Damn, I hate them. Anyway, more people. So we're going to talk about that, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of what it was about, and then my theories on if there were more. So without further ado, we'll just watch the people keep walking by with their light sweaters on. Damn them. And we'll go from there. All right. So we really have to start at the beginning of the beginning, which is President Nixon was swept into office in 1968 after, for one thing, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated, and I have a vlog on that too. If Bobby Kennedy would have been the Democrat nominee facing off against Nixon in 68, who knows, he might have won. Probably would have pulled the troops out of Vietnam. I mean, it would have been a whole different history for the United States. But anyway, he was assassinated in June 1968, and so the primary went to Hubert Humphrey, that was in 68, for the re-election. I just made a big error and I apologize. No, I don't apologize. Let's go back. Yes, that's the way it happened in 68. So in 68, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. So the Democratic nominee became Hubert Humphrey, and he ran against Richard Nixon, the Republican nominee who won the election. So from 68 to 1972, Richard Nixon is the president. And in the summer of 1972, he is gearing up for he's gearing up for the next election. He's running for re-election. Elections are going to be in November of 72, and the event we're talking about takes place in June of 72. Now, we got to back up a little. What happened was essentially, and I'm going to not take sides here, although I have definite opinions on these issues. I'm going to try to be totally apolitical. What happened was that Richard Nixon took office in 68 when the country was in a real firestorm, almost on the verge of revolution, mainly between the youth, the left, the liberals, and the conservatives. Sound familiar, folks? So the left, of course, what instigated all this was the Vietnam War. And not only the Vietnam War, but the fact that the draft was still in place. So here you had, this was not like Korea. This was kids of the 60s, in college, leaving high school, in college, boys then at that time, young men being drafted, and a lot of them that were being drafted at the time were being sent overseas to the conflict in Vietnam. And it was a very different time in American history. After the Kennedy assassination, things really changed. Patriotism was looked at twice, and the hippies took hold in about 66, and by 1968, definitely 69, 70, and into the early 70s, you had a real war left to right. Students, you had Kent State in 1970, where 4 students were murdered by National Guard, killed by National Guard. So the anti-war movement was very strong in America and on the streets. Civil rights protests and riots. Sound familiar, folks? The country was really being torn apart, and in the middle of Richard Nixon's presidency, I guess, and I'll just speculate here, that when the press, and obviously this was before the internet, so it was all 3 network stations, ABC, CBS, and NBC, and the newspapers, that was your media at the time. And, not surprisingly, shocker, the media was like it is today. It was liberal leaning. It was definitely left, on the left, definitely Democrats. If you could poll the employees for the networks and the newspapers, especially New York Times. The New York Times has always been a left-leaning liberal newspaper. Washington Post, so on and so forth. So you have the media, which is already against Nixon because he's a Republican and fairly conservative. Not actually, it would be moderately conservative by today's standards. But you have the media hating Nixon because he's a Republican. You have the media hating Vietnam because it's a war, because kids are being drafted, young American boys are being drafted into it, and they don't believe in the war. They don't believe that the United States should be interceding in a Vietnamese civil war, which ultimately, of course, we abandoned in 1975, the Vietnamese, and then, or actually earlier, and then in 1975, in 73 basically, in 75, the communists from the north took over anyway, and all those lives lost between the Viet Cong, the NVA, North Vietnamese Army, South Vietnamese Army, and the Americans, all that death, all that killing, all the American soldiers coming home with PTSD and drug addiction and all the problems that they had and still have to this day, some of them. And we lost. The communists took the country. But what's really ironic is that it's like a vacation spot for the West now. Americans don't shun Vietnam. They go there on vacation. I wouldn't, but they go to Ho Chi Minh City, I suppose, and have, noodles. Kind of ironic, isn't it? Anyway, okay, so by the summer of 72, it really started with things like the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers were a series of articles written by the New York Times because there was what happened was a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, and I have forgotten where he started. I believe Daniel Ellsberg worked at the Pentagon in National Defense. But he was by nature a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, and he opposed the war. So he took a bunch of documents and actually gave them to the New York Times, trying to expose the America's involvement in the Vietnam War. And the whole thing was a hit piece on the war and the Johnson administration prior and the Nixon administration. I don't know if they mentioned Kennedy. JFK sent the advisors. We'll never know whether JFK would have escalated the war or pulled out. But Nixon was in a very difficult place now because he feared that if he just unilaterally pulled all the troops out after years of fighting there and trying to assist the South Vietnamese in this civil war, that we would be looked on as weak, cowardly, and we would lose our stature as the number one world power. And ironically, that's exactly what happened in the end. But at that time, and that it would embolden people like terrorists to think, the United States is weak, they won't respond, they won't do anything, so let's attack them. Sound familiar, folks? So Nixon was reluctant, as was Johnson, to unilaterally pull out. So the war raged on. So there was the Pentagon Papers in, I believe, 1971. So because of the press leaks like that one, Nixon felt that the New York Times and the media were actually violating national security by revealing secrets and endangering our place, endangering our soldiers, which you can make a great case for that argument. I mean, by leaking national security secrets for the American public, it may embolden millions of citizens, and it did, who were already against the war, but it also may have put lives in jeopardy, our soldiers on the front line, and our Marines, our sailors. So what happened was, you have this war going on now, a Cold War, not a hot war, metaphorically speaking, a war between Nixon and who he considered his enemies, which was, does this sound familiar, folks? Hollywood, the media. Yeah, mainly Hollywood and the media. The left versus his conservative Republican administration, and how they were adjudicating the war in Vietnam. So with this enemies list, Nixon, I don't know if we'll never know whether he gave the order, sounds like a mafia don, whether he gave the order directly or whether the order was just passed on through John Mitchell as Attorney General or other minions. But the idea was that these voices of dissent, these voices violating national security, New York Times, Washington Post, the three networks, had to be gone after, silenced with their opposition to the war, because it was a national security threat. That was the thinking. So somehow, like I said, whether it was Nixon himself giving the order or not, somehow a team is assembled to try to create derogatory profiles on their enemies. One was, they broke into Daniel Ellsberg, and I told you about him a minute ago, who leaked the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg, they which was originally known as the Plumbers to stop leaks. The Plumbers broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office to try to find derogatory profile. And it was before the internet. It would be a lot easier now, because they could drop something on Twitter. Here's a copy of Ellsberg's report saying he's psychotic. He's schizophrenic, he's paranoid. In those days, maybe he's homosexual. That was considered a mental illness then. So if they could find a derogatory profile on their enemies, it would really assist them in crushing their enemies. That was the thought. So there was the Ellsberg break-in, and there was another part that the team was going to do was all kinds of things they had planned, mainly break-in, looking for documents. So then we have the Democratic National Committee and their headquarters in the Watergate Hotel in the summer of 1972. Now, what's really interesting was Nixon was already way up in the polls. That's why I don't believe that they did a break-in of the head of the DNC's office to try to find out what the Democrats had on Nixon, where they were in the campaign and the election. Much more than that, but that's the way it's been reported through the years, that they had put taps, that the team, the Plumbers, including the famous G. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt and those guys, and the Cubans, and those guys put a tap on the phones of the head of the Democratic National Committee, who unfortunately his name escapes me at the moment. They were going back then on that night because I think the taps weren't functioning correctly. So what happened was, they put some tape on the door outside the office building. This is the biggest blunder I've ever heard of. And then suddenly, how they didn't anticipate this, I'll never know. Security guard comes along, discovers the tape, ends up finding them, calls the cops, and everyone thinks they're burglars. And they're subsequently arrested. And by 2 years later, we have the downfall of President Nixon, because days after the break-in, it's discovered that he said in the Oval Office, tell the CIA that this is an FBI, I believe he said, tell the FBI to back off this case. This is a CIA operation. Tell them to stay out of it. Now, number one, not only was that a lie, it wasn't obviously a CIA operation, it was his plumbers, but number two, that's obstruction of justice, and that's illegal. And that was it. Once that tape was discovered, why Nixon never burned his tapes, we'll never know. But once that tape was discovered, Nixon had no more support in Congress and had to resign. He was going to be impeached, and then he would lose a trial in the Senate. Unlike President Trump, who was impeached twice, but survived both trials in the Senate, was never convicted in the Senate. So, and same thing with President Clinton, impeached but survived the trial in the Senate. So, neither were found to have committed high crimes and misdemeanors, but President Nixon certainly would have, because it's on tape. And why did Nixon bug himself in the Oval Office and only he and 2 other people or so knew about it? Who knows? Probably so he could have dirt on the people he was talking to and saying, I never said that, I never said that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So the break-in happens. And it culminates with, like I said, with Nixon's resignation. But I don't think they were just Larry O'Connor. I'm trying to think of the name of the head of the DNC. Like I said, the name escapes me. I don't think they were just looking for general dirt. I mean, there's all kinds of theories. John Dean. There's a theory that John Dean was... There's theories about John Dean's wife and prostitution in Washington, D.C., and files that the Democrats might have had on them. I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff that I've only read that in one place, and I don't know if I give that much credence. These dogs are going crazy here.
Come here.
So anyway, something, Larry O'Brien, that was his name. I think something more likely is, and again, this is conspiracy, but I think something more likely is President Nixon received, apparently, what we would call today as a bribe from Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes gave a cash payment, I believe a cash payment, to President Nixon's brother Donald. So this has been construed over this of, I don't know how much it was, but this is being construed. Now, it wouldn't be the first president or politician to take a bribe, would it? No way. People are peddling influence all the time, including in current day, but I won't go into it, present day. So apparently it was believed, at least, that's one of the theories, that there was a bribe by Howard Hughes given to President Nixon's brother, and that Larry O'Brien and the Democrats, the Democrat National Committee, had information about President Nixon's shady relationship with the always shady Howard Hughes, and that's what they were looking for in those files. So, we'll never really know, but I think it was more than just a simple break-in looking for general information, especially since it was so silly, because Nixon, even though the break-in happened in June, and they knew that Howard Hunt, for example, was involved, who was ex-CIA, it was starting to look like, even in November, because the Washington Post got on this right away, that the government might have been involved, the current administration might have been involved, but the scandal wasn't enough to stop it. In fact, Nixon won re-election in a landslide, a super landslide, against George McGovern. Now, here's what's interesting. I mean, George McGovern was a liberal dove, meaning very anti-war, pretty liberal for that day, but today he'd be almost moderate because Bernie Sanders is far left of him. Elizabeth Warren is left of him. The Squad is far left of him. So he'd be almost a moderate today. But in those days, George McGovern was considered just too liberal for the country, not moderate enough. So he lost to Nixon by a landslide. And we know what happened, obviously. After that tape was revealed, Nixon resigned, and his vice president, Gerald Ford, took office. And 2 years later, uh, when he was running for his own proper election, he lost to Jimmy Carter. And then we had 4 years of Jimmy Carter. So it really shaped everything in American history. And again, I think that the break-in of the Watergate and all the break-ins and sneaky business and dirty tricks that the plumbers were doing at the behest of the Nixon administration, John Mitchell, the Attorney General, maybe President Nixon himself, I think they're a lot more nefarious and shady than we think. Politics is a very dirty business. There's a lot of bribery and extortion. A lot of very powerful men. And now it's not so much then, but now it's powerful women and powerful men, and powerful politicians and lobbyists and dealings, and like I said, bribery and dealing with the mob and other entities that may have a stranglehold and may have dirt on these particular individuals. So I think it was a lot more a simple break-in to find, but I've said this 3 times already. The cold's getting in my brain. That's a creepy look. All right, guys. Well, Ron here. Again, kind of an obscure and an old subject, but tell me what you think if you have any theories on it. And I'll be talking to you again in the frozen tundra, maybe again tomorrow night. Okay. If you like the channel, guys, please subscribe. I work hard to keep your minds active. And as we debate these issues, we think about these issues, comment on these issues. Give the channel likes. I'd really appreciate it. That really moves things along through the algorithm of YouTube. And I'll see you at the next location. Thanks again, guys. Bye. Okay, now I'll say goodbye. Bye.